In this tutorial, I'm going to talk about cadences. In music theory, a cadence is a two-chord progression. Normally, cadences are something you can think about and apply at the end of a musical phrase. In other words, a cadence is a sequence of chords comprising the close of a musical phrase. Now, keep in mind that a musical phrase is slightly different than the 8-bar phrases we have spoken about so far. The 8-bar phrases relate to the structure of a track, usually an electronic or pop track, which is usually divided in 8-bar sections. However, musical phrases relate to short musical sections, which could be as short as 1 or 2 bars in duration. In other words, you can think of a musical phrase as a complete musical thought. The cadence is what occurs at the end of this musical thought. Technically, the kind of cadence you're going to be using depends on the last 2 chords of the passage. There are 4 main types of cadences used in music. They're called the authentic cadence, the half cadence, the Plagal Cadence, and the Deceptive Cadence. Firstly, we'll go through the authentic cadence. Now, an authentic cadence occurs when you move from the dominant chord to the tonic chord. This means you're moving from the chord which the 5th scale degree plays to the chord which the 1st scale degree plays. In the A minor scale, this would be the E minor chord and the A minor chord. Many times, a 7th is added to the dominant chord because the resolve is even stronger, but if you don't know much about what that is yet, don't worry about it. Keep in mind that authentic cadences are also known as perfect or imperfect cadences, depending on which chord inversion you play. But we won't go over this at this point as it's not important. If you look at the attached link, the basicmusictheory.com website, it explains all about inversions and 7ths over there. If we look at this MIDI file right here, it's got a normal chord progression, but it ends on an authentic cadence because it goes from the 5th scale degrees chord down to the root scale degrees chord, which means the dominant chord to the tonic chord. This can actually give it a feeling that the song is ending because it goes home when it goes to the tonic chord. And also the 5th scale degrees chord, the dominant chord, has the strongest harmonic relationship to the tonic chord than any other chord in the scale. So when you use this chord progression, it can give it a sense that that's the end of a passage or even the end of a song. This is very commonly used to end a piece of music. Let's have a listen to it, and you can also decide what this sounds like to you. There you go. You see how at the very end of the passage, it really felt like it resolved, it went home, and it ended. Of course, the song doesn't have to end there, but it's a very strong feeling of it being the end of the chord progression. Now, the second cadence we're going to talk about is called the half cadence. A half cadence is any 2 chord sequence which ends on the 5th scale degrees chord. In this cadence, the chord that precedes the 5th scale degrees chord is irrelevant. So as long as the final chord is the dominant chord, it is known as a half cadence. Because this ends on the dominant chord, it is considered a weak cadence and produces the feeling that the music should continue and not end. Therefore, a song rarely ends on a half cadence. But many songs use a half cadence in the middle of a section, such as a middle of an 8-bar phrase. But the end of a phrase tends to be more oftenly used as an authentic cadence rather than a half cadence. So if we look at this MIDI file here, the one we were working on before, this ends on a half cadence because it ends on the dominant chord, the E minor of the scale. So what we'll do is we're going to play the half cadence phrase first, and then I'll let it go on to the authentic cadence, and you'll see how the authentic cadence has a stronger feel of resolve than the half cadence does. I'm going to mute the bass just so that there isn't anything else changing the sound of the first half over the second half. Did you feel that on the second phrase, it had a stronger resolve at the end of the 8-bar phrase than at the end of the first phrase? Because we brought it home. We went back to the root chord of our scale. Next, let's look at the plagal cadence. Now, a plagal cadence occurs when the 4th scale degrees chord, also known as the subdominant chord, moves to the 1st scale degrees chord, also known as the tonic chord. This can actually be used as an alternative to the authentic cadence in order to end the song, because this cadence also ends on the tonic chord, and musicians, like I said, call this coming home. And ending the song on the tonic chord of a key produces a clear feeling that it's the end of a phrase or piece. But also it tends to sound a little bit less expected, just because it's usually expected from the dominant chord you go to the tonic chord, but it's not as common that from the subdominant chord you end up to the tonic chord. And therefore it can sound quite interesting, perhaps a bit more interesting than going from the 5th chord to the root chord. Let's have a listen to what it sounds. I've got it here. So the same chord progression as the previous two, but this time going from the subdominant chord, which is the D, to the A. There you go. Finally, we have the deceptive cadence. A deceptive cadence is a chord sequence in which the dominant chord, which is the 5th scale degrees chord, moves to any chord that is anything other than the root chord, the tonic chord. It's called a deceptive cadence because the listener expects the chord to resolve to the tonic, because in the authentic cadence we go from the 5th scale degrees chord to the root chord, but in the deceptive cadence, we don't. We go from the 5th scale degrees chord to any other chord in our scale. So I've got a deceptive cadence over here. Again, it's the same chord progression as before, but it's ending, instead of going to the root or the 5th, we're going to a C major chord, which is a different chord in our scale. There you go. Now you could combine and mix and match all of these in order to create a song that continuously changes and therefore produces interest and keeps the listener intact, right? So we could have a half cadence ending going into an authentic cadence ending at the end of the second phrase. Perhaps going back into a half cadence ending, going into a plagal cadence ending, when people would actually expect an authentic cadence ending. So half cadence at the end of the first 8 bars, authentic cadence at the end of the second phrase, half cadence again, plagal cadence instead of an authentic cadence. Then we could go back to a half cadence and finish it perhaps on an authentic cadence. And we could leave the deceptive cadence for the next set of phrases. And this is what this passage would sound like. Now, I just want to say a few final words regarding cadences. They're great pieces of information to have in order to help you pick the correct chords to end a musical passage or phrase. But don't worry about them too much. Look at the chords available in your scale, pick 2 or 3, and just try to compose a chord progression using those chords, and you're going to be okay. A couple of tips I would give you: try and pick the tonic chord of your scale and go back to it every bar, or at least at the beginning of each phrase, just to enforce the fact to the listener that you're in the scale that you have chosen. If you don't do this, it may sound as though you're playing in a different scale or something known as a different mode in your scale. And that's something that you don't really need to worry about, especially just as you're starting to learn music theory, but you can look at in the future. Another thing is, remember that the tonic chord, which is the first scale degree chord, the dominant chord, which is the fifth scale degree chord, they have a very strong harmonic relationship. So generally, if you use those chords, your song can sound a little bit more poppy, perhaps a little bit more on the side of cheesiness, I would say, if you use them too much. Of course, if you use them to end your song as a cadence, that's not a problem at all. But just keep that in mind. Depending on the style of music you want to create, you may want to go for perhaps the second scale degree chords and the sixth scale degree chords, perhaps even the subdominants, the fourth scale degree chords. Additionally, look at how to add the seventh to the chords. This basically takes a triad chord, which is what we've been working with, which is 3 notes. It is the root note, the minor or major third, and the perfect fifth intervals. And you're adding the seventh intervals into the chord. So it would be either the minor or major seventh. So for example, the first phrase over here, we could take the C, move it to the seventh, and we would get an A minor seventh chord. We could also move this to the seventh. So now we have no longer a triad chord, we have a minor seventh chord. It just adds quite a bit of interest to it. So all we're doing by adding the seventh is simply taking the last note of the chord, which is the fifth, taking it up by 2 intervals within the scale though. So make sure you know exactly which interval you're supposed to place it on. Again, if you look at the basicmusictheory.com, you could easily find all of the notes within any scale that you choose. There you go. And select the correct note. And finally, just as I showed you in the previous video, definitely use that trick where you input all the MIDI notes within your scale and then you click on fold. So there's no chance of you inputting a wrong note or a note that isn't in the scale at all. Thank you very much. See you in the next video.